At dawn, the church bell rang once. Not twice. Not for prayer. Just once. In St. Bartholomew Parish, South Carolina, that sound meant something had been taken. The child disappeared before the sun cleared the cypress trees. No footprints. No struggle. No witnesses. Only a single shoe left behind near the slave quarters. Polished leather, far too fine for a field hand. When the overseer arrived, he froze. The shoe was his size. The stitching, custom, imported. Something only a plantation owner could afford. And the child who wore it had his eyes. The town never recorded the disappearance. No notice. No sermon. No burial. By nightfall, the name was forbidden. Mothers whispered it into pillows. Fathers drank themselves into silence. And the bell was never rung again. Because this was not the first child who vanished. For decades, South Carolina plantations had been finding enslaved children who bore impossible resemblances to the men who owned them. Same jaw. Same scar. Same birthmark hidden beneath linen collars. And when these children reached a certain age, when resemblance turned from coincidence into certainty, they were removed. Quietly. This is not a story preserved in textbooks. It exists only in church margins, orphanage ledgers, and letters never sent. A pattern hidden by sermons, law, and silence. What the town feared was not scandal. It was recognition. Because every time one of these children was found, another family's secret disappeared with them. In 1843, a newly assigned minister named Elias Crowell arrived at St. Bartholomew's Church. He was young, earnest, and dangerously curious. While cataloging baptism records, Crowell noticed something strange. Entire pages were missing. Others had ink deliberately scraped away, names erased so aggressively the paper had thinned. But the dates remained. Always the same pattern. A child baptized. No surname recorded. Skin described as mixed or uncertain. Father left blank. And then, nothing. No marriage. No burial. No adulthood. When Crowell asked the elder deacons, they told him the children had been relocated for their own protection. But no one could say where, or why protection was necessary from their own families. The minister began visiting nearby plantations. What he saw unsettled him. Children in the slave quarters who looked like reflections, pale eyes among dark faces, straight noses where generations had not shaped them so. Overseers referred to them as houseborn. The enslaved women never met his gaze when asked about the fathers. And every child had one thing in common. They were never allowed to grow up here. At age 10, 12, sometimes 14, they were sent away to church-run orphanages, to distant seminaries, to training houses funded by the same men who owned the land. Crowell wrote in his journal, "They remove the evidence before it learns to speak." 3 weeks later, his journal ended abruptly. The final page was torn out. Crowell was transferred north without explanation. St. Bartholomew's records were locked, and the children kept disappearing. 30 miles from Charleston stood the Ashcombe Home for Colored Youth, an orphanage financed entirely by donations from prominent plantation families. Officially, it was a place of salvation, education, moral correction. Unofficially, it was a dead end. The building sat beside a slow, black river that swallowed sound. Children arrived by carriage at night. No names, no family history, only a number sewn into their clothes. Former caretakers later described the children as confused and withdrawn. Many believed they were being punished, though none knew why. They were instructed never to speak of their parents, never to ask questions about their faces. The boys were trained for labor elsewhere. The girls were taught obedience and silence. And those who asked too many questions, who stared too long into mirrors, or spoke the names of men they resembled, were marked. Records show a category simply labeled transferred. No destination listed. One surviving ledger includes a chilling margin note. Resemblance undeniable. Removal urgent. Local fishermen claimed that sometimes, late at night, carriages left the orphanage heavier than they arrived. That the river carried voices afterward, soft, pleading, unfinished. But no investigation was ever opened. Because the orphanage was protected by the church. And the church was protected by the town. Every year, on the same Sunday in August, St. Bartholomew's held a special sermon. No announcement. No explanation. Only the plantation owners attended. Doors locked. Windows shuttered. The sermon was always titled the same. On the preservation of order. Witnesses recalled the language was strange, almost ritualistic. The preacher spoke of lineage, contamination, and divine hierarchy. He warned that sins of the flesh could echo through generations if not corrected. Correction meant removal. Correction meant silence. Correction meant that bloodlines must remain unbroken in the eyes of the world, even if they were already broken in truth. After the sermon, donations were collected, funds routed to orphanages, seminaries, distant institutions that specialized in making people disappear. And afterward, the bell rang once. Not for prayer, for erasure. By 1850, entire counties knew the pattern. Everyone recognized the children. Everyone avoided speaking their names. The resemblance was undeniable, but acknowledgement would mean collapse. Because to admit the truth would mean admitting that the plantation system was not just built on labor, but on blood. There was a flaw the system never corrected. Memory. No matter how far the children were sent, no matter how many names were stripped away, some of them remembered. Not events, but sensations. The smell of a specific study. The sound of a man coughing behind a closed door. The way a ring scraped wood when a hand clenched. At Ashcombe Home, caretakers noticed it first during prayer. Certain children flinched when particular plantation surnames were spoken. Others stared too long at portraits during chapel visits, faces of benefactors lining the walls. They did not know why the faces felt familiar, only that they did. One boy, listed only as number 47, refused to kneel before a portrait of Colonel Nathaniel Hargreave. He began shaking uncontrollably. When questioned, he said something no child should have known. He locks the door twice, the boy whispered. Once with the key, once with fear. The caretakers wrote him up as unstable. 2 weeks later, he was marked transferred. After that incident, mirrors were removed from the orphanage dormitories. Reflections, it was believed, encouraged recognition. Recognition led to questions. Questions led to collapse. The children were taught to avert their eyes, not just from mirrors, but from each other. Because resemblance did not stop at the owners. Some children looked alike. Brothers, sisters, half-siblings scattered across counties, unknowingly praying in the same rooms. The system depended on one thing above all else: that the children would never meet long enough to compare faces. Not all children went to orphanages. Those deemed intellectually dangerous were sent to places with softer names and harsher rules. Church seminaries designed for moral purification. One such place was St. Jude's Preparatory Seminary, hidden among longleaf pines near the Georgia border. Officially, St. Jude's trained mixed-race boys for clerical service in black congregations. Unofficially, it specialized in obedience. Students rose before dawn, spoke only when addressed, confessed sins they did not understand. The curriculum focused obsessively on humility and inherited guilt. They were taught that their existence was a trial placed upon others, and that gratitude meant silence. But St. Jude's had another purpose. Physicians visited monthly. Measurements were taken, faces examined, heads tilted under lamplight. The records were not spiritual, they were anatomical. One recovered ledger lists entries such as jawline, confirmed, ocular match, strong, temperament, mirrors paternal disposition. Beside many names is a single word written in red ink. Risk. Those marked as risks were isolated, given extra instruction, then quietly removed. A former groundskeeper later claimed there was a locked basement wing beneath the chapel, rooms without windows, used only briefly. He said hymns were sung louder on days when boys went downstairs, so the prayers would cover the crying. The system could not function without women. Enslaved women knew the truth long before any child could speak it. They saw who visited their quarters, who returned, who avoided eye contact afterward. They carried secrets in their bodies and paid for them with their lives. Some women tried to mark their children. A scar placed carefully, a song taught only to them, a whispered name in the dark. Others went further. In 1838, plantation records from Beaufort County show 3 enslaved women executed for conspiracy and incitement. No further details were recorded, but a private letter between 2 planters tells another story. They were teaching the children to recognize themselves. That was the true crime. Teaching a child that resemblance was not coincidence. That blood carried memory. That faces told stories no ledger could erase. After that year, new measures were enacted. Children were separated earlier. Mothers sold away faster. Breastfeeding discouraged. Emotional bonds classified as disruptive influences. The system learned. But so did the women. Some began to disappear on their own terms, walking into swamps, rivers, forests, leaving behind children with nothing but questions and faces that would one day condemn them. Charleston society prided itself on refinement, manners, order, decorum, and nowhere was decorum more violently enforced than around the children. At markets, townspeople noticed. At church, they noticed. At social gatherings, they noticed. A child passing too close to a white family, sharing a smile too similar to ignore. The response was always the same. Eyes turned away. Conversations shifted. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else changed the subject. Because to acknowledge resemblance would mean acknowledging violation, not just of enslaved women, but of the moral architecture holding the town together. Doctors quietly altered birth records. Midwives were paid to forget. Preachers reframed sin as necessity. Lawyers buried claims before they were ever written. And anyone who spoke openly, too openly, was ruined. One schoolteacher who asked why certain children vanished was accused of impropriety and forced to leave the state. A newspaper editor who hinted at unspoken kinship lost his press in a suspicious fire. The message was clear. See nothing. Say nothing. Survive. Despite everything, the system fractured once. In 1849, 3 boys from different plantations escaped together. They did not plan it. They simply recognized one another. Same eyes. Same scar behind the left ear. Same face, worn differently by circumstance. They ran at night. Not north, but inward, toward the swamps where maps failed. They believed, irrationally but powerfully, that if they stayed together, the truth could not be erased. For 2 weeks, they survived, sharing memories they did not understand, speaking names they had overheard but never been allowed to claim. When they were captured, the punishment was swift and absolute. No public record exists of what happened next. But after that year, new legislation was quietly introduced restricting movement, education, and congregation of mixed-race children. The law did not mention resemblance. It did not need to. By the early 1850s, even the church struggled to contain the weight of its own silence. Some junior clergy broke. Confession booths heard truths never meant for absolution. Preachers dreamed of faces watching them from pews that no longer existed. One priest wrote before his death, "We have baptized our sins and called them mercy." He was found drowned in the river behind Ashcombe home. The death was ruled accidental. The ledger, noting his final confession, was missing. The church continued. Because institutions do not repent, they endure. By 1860, the ground beneath South Carolina was already cracking, not from cannons, but from exposure. Rumors of war spread faster than sermons. Enslaved people whispered of freedom. Plantation owners whispered of reckoning. And beneath both fears lay a deeper terror. What would happen if the children were no longer controllable? War does not just destroy nations. It loosens records, moves people, breaks routines. And routines were the spine of the system. Plantation families began urgent correspondence with churches and orphanages. Instructions were clear: accelerate removals, destroy redundant ledgers, consolidate problem cases. Some children vanished months before the first shots were fired. In one letter, a landowner wrote, "The coming chaos must not reveal what order concealed." Several orphanages abruptly closed. Children were marched inland. Seminaries evacuated under the pretense of safety. No lists of names survived, only tallies. During this time, witnesses later recalled a strange phenomenon. Children began appearing who did not belong anywhere. Mixed-race adolescents wandering roads alone, speaking educated English, quoting scripture incorrectly, but confidently, claiming no family, yet knowing intimate details of plantation houses they had never officially entered. Soldiers called them ghost sons. Most were turned away. Some were forcibly returned. Others simply disappeared again, swallowed by the movement of war. Freedom was approaching, and the truth was running. When emancipation finally arrived, it shattered the visible structure of slavery, but not its secrets. Records were destroyed en masse. Plantation archives burned accidentally. Church basements flooded. Orphanage doors were found locked and abandoned. Freedom created a new problem. What happens when people are allowed to ask who they are? Formerly enslaved families began searching for children taken years earlier. They approached churches, county offices, former owners. They were told the children had died or been relocated. or never existed. But some children returned on their own. Young men with familiar faces standing at plantation gates, not as property, but as free people, looking directly at men who recognized themselves in those eyes. The reactions varied. Some slammed doors. Some paid them to leave. Some threatened them into silence. A few, very few, panicked. In at least 2 documented cases, plantation owners fled the state entirely after being confronted by freedmen who looked exactly like them. These confrontations never made the newspapers, because no one wanted to explain them. Reconstruction brought schools, charities, aid societies, and with them, a new generation of institutions ready to inherit old secrets. Northern missionaries noticed the resemblance immediately, but they interpreted it differently, not as evidence of systemic violation, but as individual tragedy, isolated incidents, moral failures. The pattern remained unspoken. Some freed children were steered into industrial schools, others into psychiatric hospitals, places where identity could be questioned, redefined, or erased under clinical language. Medical files from the 1870s contained disturbing notes, delusions of kinship, fixation on resemblance, claims lineage incongruent with station. These diagnoses were not meant to heal. They were meant to neutralize. Because a child who believes they are related to power is dangerous in a society trying to pretend that power was never misused. Technology preserved what language refused to name. In the late 19th century, photography became common. Family portraits, school photos, church gatherings, and suddenly, the resemblance could no longer be dismissed. There are surviving photographs, still archived in Southern historical societies, where a white family poses on a porch while, in the background, a black child stands just close enough for comparison. Same posture, same brow, same hands. Archivists labeled these images as coincidental proximity. But families noticed. Some photographs were cut, faces removed, backgrounds burned. Entire albums destroyed when children grew old enough to resemble the men too closely. One archivist wrote in a private note, "The camera sees what the town refuses to." And the town responded by hiding the camera. By 1900, the original perpetrators were dying. But silence is an inheritance. Their sons learned not to ask. Their daughters learned not to look. The next generation learned which topics caused rooms to go cold. Children were taught family trees that skipped branches, stories that began conveniently after the war, portraits of ancestors without context. And still, occasionally, a child would be born who carried too much resemblance. A jawline no one could explain, eyes that unsettled elders, a laugh that ended conversations. These children were not enslaved, but they were managed, sent away to boarding schools, encouraged to marry elsewhere, quietly distanced from inheritance. The old system adapted, not through chains, but through omission. Certain South Carolina towns developed reputations for being strange. Outsiders noted how people avoided discussing the past, how graveyards lacked dates, how churches held records that began abruptly decades after their founding. Elders would say, some things were buried for everyone's good. But at night, stories emerged. Stories of children who knocked on doors claiming kinship, of mothers who recognized sons they had been forced to forget, of faces appearing in dreams, watching silently, accusing nothing, forgiving nothing. The trauma did not fade. It seeped. In 1912, a Charleston doctor attempted what no one else dared. He began documenting facial inheritance patterns across racial lines, privately, methodically, using photographs, measurements, and genealogy. His conclusion was devastating. This was not rare. It was not accidental. It was systemic. Before he could publish, his notes vanished. His reputation collapsed under accusations of impropriety. He died professionally ruined. But one letter survived. They are afraid not because it happened, but because it happened so often. Some of the children survived. They became teachers, preachers, laborers, parents. They carried faces that told stories no one would validate. Many struggled with identity, not knowing whether to hate, forgive, or mourn what had been stolen from them. Their pain was not just personal. It was historical, because they were living evidence of a crime the nation wanted to believe was abstract. History prefers clean lines. Villains here, victims there, redemption at the end. This story had none of that. It implicated churches, families, towns, entire systems. It blurred the boundary between private sin and public order. So it was buried, not with denial, but with discomfort. By the mid-20th century, the last of the witnesses were gone. But the truth did not disappear. It waited. In faces, in photographs, in silences passed from parent to child, waiting for someone to finally say. They were not coincidences. By the 1920s, something changed. Not in law, not in sermons, but in visibility. Children born decades after emancipation began noticing resemblances on their own. Mirrors became confrontational objects. Photographs circulated more freely. Schoolbooks included portraits of local, founding families. And some students recognized themselves in those images. Young men stared at textbook illustrations of Civil War officers and felt an unnamed familiarity. Young women compared their reflections to portraits hanging in courthouses and felt unease instead of pride. This generation did not know the original crime, but they inherited its aftermath. Teachers noticed certain students being treated differently by white benefactors, discouraged from ambition, quietly redirected from leadership, warned away from local history projects. Because resemblance was no longer a private terror, it was becoming visible again. In 1927, a county archivist named Margaret Hale began reorganizing South Carolina parish records. She was meticulous, apolitical, trusted, and she noticed patterns others avoided. Baptismal entries with missing fathers. Repeated annotations like removed or relocated across decades. Entire family names appearing as benefactors immediately after certain children vanished. Hale cross-referenced photographs. She lined them up. Faces matched. Her private notes show hesitation, not disbelief, but dread. This is not inheritance. This is replication. Before she could share her findings, her position was terminated. Official reason, budget cuts. Her notes were confiscated. Only a single index card survived, found decades later in an uncatalogued box. It read, "The resemblance was never accidental. It was managed. During the Great Depression, many families, black and white, were forced closer together by necessity. Lines blurred, conversations slipped, and children asked questions. Why do I look like him? Why does no one answer? Why do adults get angry when I ask?" Some parents confessed in fragments. Others shut down entirely. In several towns, teenagers who pursued local genealogy projects were discouraged by school boards. Libraries quietly restricted access to certain archives. A pattern emerged. The closer someone came to connecting faces across racial lines, the faster doors closed. This was not about preserving dignity. It was about preserving a version of history that could still function. There are cemeteries in South Carolina with no names. Rows of stones marked only by numbers. Some not marked at all. Officially, they belong to orphaned children, transient laborers, or the unknown dead. But records suggest something else. A disproportionate number of adolescents. Burials clustered around the years when children were removed from institutions. No corresponding death certificates. One gravedigger wrote in his memoir, "They buried boys who looked like men who were still alive." The memoir was never published, but the graves remain. By the 1930s, genetics was becoming a science. Doctors understood inheritance more clearly, and some realized, with horror, what the resemblance implied. A small number attempted to study it. They were discouraged. Funding was pulled. Careers stalled. Journals rejected papers as a socially destabilizing. One physician wrote privately, "We are asked to believe a miracle of coincidence that repeats itself for a century." Science, like religion before it, was guided away from certain conclusions. World War II created a new national narrative. Unity, sacrifice, progress. There was no room for buried domestic crimes. The past was framed as unfortunate, but resolved. Slavery became something distant, abstract, finished. The children, now adults, were expected to move on. And many did. Not because they found peace, but because survival required it. The second silence was quieter than the first, and more complete. In 1948, a photograph surfaced at a small-town estate sale. It showed a plantation porch, circa 1855. A white family seated proudly in front. And behind them, just inside the frame, a young enslaved boy. The resemblance was undeniable. Same eyes, same mouth, same posture. The buyer attempted to donate the photograph to a local museum. The museum declined. No explanation given. The photograph disappeared again. The final generation did not inherit documents. They inherited warnings. Don't dig. Leave it alone. Some truths don't help. But warnings carry implication. And implication carries curiosity. By 1950, South Carolina looked forward, not backward. But certain families still avoided mirrors. Certain churches still locked basements. Certain towns still reacted strangely to genealogists. Fear lingered, not of exposure, but of recognition. Because recognition does not accuse. It confirms. The system ended. The silence did not. It adapted into tradition, discomfort, omission. But faces do not forget where they come from. And neither does blood. In the 1960s, a quiet migration began. Not north, not west, but back. Descendants of those erased children returned to South Carolina, searching for roots that had never been acknowledged. Some came with surnames that did not match their faces. Others came with photographs passed down in secrecy, faces that mirrored people buried in local graveyards under different names. They visited courthouses, churches, libraries, and encountered the same response every time. Files missing, basements closed, records lost to time. But something had changed. This generation refused to stop asking. In 1968, a high school history class in rural South Carolina visited a restored plantation as part of a heritage tour. One student, black, 17 years old, stopped abruptly in front of a portrait. He began shaking. The portrait depicted the plantation's former owner, painted in 1842. Same face, same scar above the eyebrow. The tour guide attempted to move on. The student refused. The room fell silent. That moment was not recorded in the official tour logs. But everyone present remembered it. Because recognition had finally occurred in public. During the civil rights era, genealogists began using oral histories instead of documents. Elders, long silent, began speaking in fragments. They told of children taken. Faces matched. Bells rung once. They spoke carefully. Still afraid. But they spoke. Churches were confronted. Some denied everything. Others admitted complex histories. None offered records. Because admission would mean accountability. And accountability would unravel generations of inheritance, wealth, and moral authority. In 1972, the ruins of Ashcombe Home were finally demolished. Before destruction, a volunteer discovered a sealed wall. Inside were dozens of small personal items. Shoes, Bibles, locks of hair, photographs cut from frames, and a single ledger page. It contained no names. Only a sentence, written repeatedly in different handwriting. We look like them. The page vanished during transit. But the volunteers never forgot it. There were no trials, no apologies, no official acknowledgments. Because the crimes were diffuse, spread across institutions, normalized by time. There was no single villain. Only a system that worked too well. Even now, people visiting South Carolina sometimes experience something they cannot explain. A stranger who looks familiar. A face in an old photograph that feels personal. A sense of being recognized by a place that should not know them. This is not superstition. It is inheritance. This is not a ghost story. No spirits linger. No curses remain. What endures is something far more unsettling. Memory. Written into bone. Carried in features. Passed silently across generations. The horror was not what happened. The horror was how efficiently it was hidden. Most towns never spoke publicly. They did not need to. Silence had become tradition. And tradition rarely feels like violence to those who inherit it. Because history does not stay buried. Because faces do not lie. Because every erased child became a question passed forward in time. Waiting. St. Bartholomew's bell still hangs. It has not rung once in over a century. Not for prayer. Not for warning. Because if it rang again, someone would have to ask why it rang the first time.